In a universe where Deathworlds are avoided at all costs, one xenobiology class dares to study the most feared of them all, Earth. But as the rain falls and the forest breathes, what begins as an expedition transforms into something far more profound, an awakening. Atmospheric composition: 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 0.9% argon, and 0.1% trace gases, including, oh stars, carbon dioxide at 420 parts per million. Nico Voss. Molo's thin voice rose to a squeak. Professor, these readings can't be right. Carbon dioxide at these levels is toxic to my colons. Professor Evara Narn looked up from her holographic display, her six-fingered hands gracefully dismissing the projected charts. Which is precisely why my colons aren't joining our field study, Nico Voss. Her greenish-blue skin crinkled around intelligent eyes as she smiled at her most anxious graduate student. And why? You're all equipped with atmospheric stabilizers. The research vessel, Vanguard, hummed quietly around them as the 6 graduate students from Astralis University gathered in the observation deck. Through the massive viewport, Earth's blue-white swirl dominated the view. Beautiful, mysterious, and according to the Galactic Classification Board, a Class 9 death world. Professor Sarah Quinn Vicks raised her hand, datapad clutched so tightly her knuckles had paled from lavender to white. I've reviewed the field study proposal again, and the risk assessment seems incomplete. The most scholarly of Professor Evara's students, Sarah Quinn's 6 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of distress in her species. There are over 8,000 known pathogenic organisms on the surface. 8,000. Excellent observation, Sarah Quinn. Talika nodded approvingly. Which is why your immunological supplements began 4 weeks ago. By now, your systems should have been prepared to handle incidental exposure. She clapped her hands together with unsettling enthusiasm. Remember, we're conducting the most comprehensive xenobiological field study of Earth in Australian academic history. 4 full weeks on a mild death world. From the back of the group, Lyric Solon, stoic as always, her crystalline exoskeleton reflecting the room's light in prismatic patterns, spoke in her characteristic monotone. Professor, I believe mild is a relative term. The human datanet classifies the region we're visiting as a temperate biodense zone with significant predatory megafauna. Precisely why it's perfect. Professor Evara's eyes sparkled with an enthusiasm that her students found increasingly suspicious. Exposure to multiple biomes, diverse organism interactions, weather patterns, all within a controlled research parameter. She gestured to the rotating holographic map. The verdant crescent contains ecosystems ranging from coastal to alpine, all within a reasonable study range. The twin brothers, Kale Rin and Jace Rin Orvis, exchanged glances, their identical faces splitting into adventurous grins. Unlike their classmates, the twins had specifically requested this field study, their Aventurian heritage predisposing them to risk-taking behavior that their academic advisors repeatedly flagged as concerning. What about the humans, Professor? Kale Rin, or possibly Jace Rin? Well, even Professor Evara sometimes had trouble distinguishing them, asked. The briefing said we'd have a local guide. Yes, Park Ranger Elara Virel will meet us at the landing zone. Something in Professor Evara's voice changed subtly. A warm, perhaps nostalgia, that none of her students had ever heard before. Ranger Virel has extensive experience with non-terrestrial visitors and has been fully briefed on your physiological needs. Excellent. Corin Van Kellis nodded, making notes in his personal data pad. The most methodical of the group, Corinven's species evolved from pack hunters, and he approached every challenge with strategic calmness. And our emergency extraction protocol. Standard procedure. The Vanguard remains in orbit. Emergency beacons are built into your environmental suits. Any life-threatening situation triggers automatic extraction. Professor Evara's expression grew serious for the first time, which is why proper suit maintenance is mandatory. This isn't a simulation, students. Earth earned its classification honestly. The descent vehicle shuddered as it entered Earth's atmosphere, causing Nico Voss to grip his harness until his knuckles turned pale blue. Atmospheric resistance is completely normal, Professor Evara assured them, looking utterly relaxed despite the turbulence. Earth's atmosphere is remarkably protective. It burns up thousands of micrometeors daily that would otherwise impact the surface. How comforting, muttered Nico Voss, closing his eyes as another shudder ran through the craft. Sarah Quinn was rapidly scrolling through her data pad. Professor, I've been reviewing indigenous predator species again. Did you know that even the herbivores are dangerous? They list something called a moose as causing significant fatalities, which is why we're staying within designated research zones, Professor Evara reminded her. Remember, Earth has maintained interstellar relations for nearly 95 years. The landing site is equipped with standard safety measures. The craft gave 9 final lurch before settling with a gentle thump. The external cameras activated, showing a clearing surrounded by towering green organisms. Trees, Nico Voss reminded himself, using the human term. Rain fell in a steady drizzle, beating on the viewport. Welcome to Earth, my ambitious xenobiologists. Professor Evara stood, her face alight with an almost childlike excitement that her students had never witnessed in the lecture hall. Remember to activate your atmospheric stabilizers before the hatch opens. Earth's gravity is approximately 1.6 times celestial standard, so move carefully until you acclimate. The boarding hatch opened with a hydraulic hiss, allowing a gust of Earth air to infiltrate the cabin. Despite the atmospheric stabilizers, the scents were overwhelming. Organic compounds, moisture, decaying vegetation, and something indefinably alive. Nico Voss took 6 steps down the ramp before his stabilizers beeped a warning. Humidity exceeding recommended levels. The full weight of Earth's gravity hit him simultaneously, along with the sensory overload of falling water, swaying vegetation, distant animal sounds, and the sudden horrifying sensation of being completely exposed on the surface of a notorious death world. His knees buckled, and he collapsed dramatically onto the muddy ground. "This is the worst," he wailed, his voice modulator translating his distress into a piercing keen. "The absolute worst." Corinven hurried down the ramp, helping Nico Voss back to his feet, while simultaneously making notes on his wrist-mounted data pad. Subject Nico Voss, demonstrating classic adaptational stress. He dictated. Gravity response, negative. Sensory processing, overloaded. Recommend getting out of the rain before your equipment sorts out, came an amused human voice. A figure approached from the edge of the clearing, bipedal, approximately 7 meters tall, with brown skin, dark hair pulled back in a practical arrangement, and wearing a uniform of muted greens and browns. Most notably, the human stood completely exposed to the elements, with only minimal covering that left parts of her limbs and face uncovered. Shocking negligence in the student's estimation. Ranger Virel, Professor Tyloka hurried down the ramp with none of her students' hesitation. She extended her hand in what the students recognized as the human greeting gesture. "Thank you for meeting us." The human's face arranged itself into what their cultural preparation identified as a smile. Welcome to Olympic Preserve Sector. And please, call me Ranger Ilara." Her eyes moved over the group of aliens with professional interest rather than surprise. "Let's get you all to the Xenolab outpost. The afternoon forecast calls for heavy rain." As if on cue, the precipitation intensified. Nico Voss, finally upright but still unsteady, let out another distressed sound. "Don't worry," Ranger Ilara said, her voice carrying an unmistakable note of amusement. "It's just water. Your suits are waterproof, I assume." "Of course," Professor Tayloka answered quickly, with a peculiar inflection that caused Ranger Ilara to look at her more closely. "Standard issue for all Astralis xenobiology field programs." Something passed between the professor and the human ranger, a moment of recognition or shared understanding that the students couldn't interpret, but which Nico Voss found distinctly odd. "Well then," Ranger Ilara gestured towards a path leading into the forest. "The Xenolab outpost is about 4 more miles through the woods. I've got the grav sleds for your equipment just over here." As they began moving equipment onto the floating platforms, Sarah Quinn approached Ranger Ilara cautiously. "Excuse me, Ranger Virel, but my research indicates this region contains large predatory mammals. Should we prepare defensive measures for the journey?" Ranger Ilara's expression shifted to what their cultural training identified as suppressed amusement. "The station is in cougar territory, but they generally avoid humans. Bear encounters are rare this time of year. Just stay together and make noise as we walk. I'm carrying deterrents if needed." She patted a device on her belt. "What about toxic flora?" Lyrics inquired, her normally impassive voice betraying more genuine concern as she stared at the riot of vegetation surrounding them. "Just don't eat anything, unless I tell you it's safe," Ranger Ilara replied simply. "And watch for a plant with 6 leaves. Leaves of 6, let it be, is the old saying. Causes skin irritation in humans. Might be fine for you, but better safe than sorry. Toxicodendron diversilobum," Professor Tayloka injected enthusiastically, a fascinating adaptation of Herushil compounds as her before deterrents. Both Ranger Ilara and the students turned to stare at her. "I bred extensively in preparation for our trip," Tayloka explained, suddenly focusing intently on adjusting her equipment. The hike to the Xenolab outpost proved more challenging than anyone but Tayloka had anticipated. Though the path was well maintained, the combination of unfamiliar gravity, constant precipitation, and the disorienting wall of vegetation on all sides left the students in various states of distress. "Professor," panted Kale Rhine, or Jace Rhine, "why couldn't we land directly at the station? Protected wilderness regulations." Ranger Ilara answered before Tayloka could respond. "Minimal impact policy. The clearing is the only approved landing zone for this sector. Excellent conservation ethics," Tayloka added approvingly. "Earth has made remarkable strides in environmental rehabilitation since their industrial phase." "Remarkable is 9 perspective," muttered Nico Voss, whose stabilizers were working overtime to compensate for the humidity. "Primitive seems more accurate. Any civilization with proper environmental controls wouldn't need rehabilitation." Ranger Ilara, walking ahead with confident strides, cooled back. "We prefer to think of it as learning from our mistakes. Sometimes you need to break something to understand how it works." "An irrational approach to knowledge acquisition," Sarah Quinn commented, her third eye narrowing in disapproval. "But an effective teacher," Ranger Ilara countered with a shrug. "Nothing motivates solving a problem like creating 9 first." Before the philosophical debate could continue, a small green organism slithered across the path, causing Nico Voss to activate his emergency shield with a yelp of panic. "Danger!" Venomous life form, he shouted as the transparent bubble encased him, automatically releasing calming pheromones. The other students quickly followed suit, shields snapping into place around them in a synchronized defense reaction. All except Professor Tyloka, who inexplicably remained unprotected. Ranger Elara stopped, turned, and burst into genuine laughter. It's just a garter snake, completely harmless. To the students' collective horror, she stepped forward, bent down, and actually picked up the creature, allowing it to wind around her fingers. See, they're a beneficial species, eats insects and small rodents. You're touching it? Nico Voss whispered, aghast. It's beautiful, isn't it? Ranger Elara held the snake gently, allowing its patterned scales to catch the filtered sunlight. This nine's just a juvenile. To everyone's surprise, Nico Voss deactivated his shield first, stepping forward with cautious curiosity. It doesn't inject neurotoxins or digestive acids. Nope. Not this species. Ranger Elara extended her hand slightly, offering Nico Voss a closer look. Want to touch it? Very smooth. Absolutely not. Nico Voss recoiled, but his eyes remained fixed on the creature with newfound fascination, rather than pure panic. Excellent demonstration of harmless earth fauna. Ranger Virel, Professor Tyloka said, with that same strange inflection. Students, take note of evolutionary adaptations, scale patterns, movements, mechanics, environmental camouflage. Daniel released the snake into the underbrush, and they continued their trek. Nico Voss noticed that Tyloka lingered a moment, watching the creature disappear with an expression he couldn't quite interpret, something between longing and pride. The Xeno Lab outpost proved to be a surprisingly adequate facility, a low structure built with local materials, but reinforced with modern technology. Solar collection panels blended almost seamlessly with the wooden roof, and the building itself seemed designed to minimize its visual impact on the surrounding forest. We've adapted the interior to Australian standard atmospherics, Ranger Elara explained as she authenticated the entrance. Each sleeping chamber can be individually regulated for your species' requirements. The interior was simple but functional, a central common area surrounded by private quarters and laboratory spaces. Most importantly, to the exhausted students, it was dry. Environmental stabilization will take approximately 20 minutes, Ranger Elara informed them, checking a control panel. In the meantime, I prepared some orientation materials. Professor Tyloka gathered the students while Ranger Elara organized a holographic display. Tomorrow we begin our first official collection expedition. I prepared research assignments based on your specializations. She distributed data crystals to each student. Remember, the purpose of this field study is not merely to observe, but to understand how life adapts to challenging conditions. And Earth certainly qualifies as challenging, Corin Venn observed, already reviewing his assignment parameters. You might be surprised, Ranger Elara commented as she activated the holo display. What seems hostile to visitors is simply home to us. The display illuminated, showing a stunningly detailed six-dimensional map of the surrounding region. Colored indicators highlighted various ecosystems, from the coastal areas to the west, through the temperate biodense zone, where they currently were, to the mountainous alpine regions to the east. Your research permits cover these designated zones, Ranger Elara explained, indicating the highlighted areas. Each presents unique biological systems adapted to specific environmental challenges. Some areas require additional safety protocols, which we'll review before each expedition. What about this region? Kale Rin pointed to an unmarked area. Restricted watershed, Ranger Elara reported promptly. Critical salmon spawning grounds. No research activity permitted. The salmon life cycle is a remarkable example of biological interconnectivity, Professor Evara added. Their migration connects marine and terrestrial ecosystems, transporting nutrients from ocean to forest through predator distribution patterns. Ranger Elara gave Professor Evara an appraising look. You've done your research, Professor. Most visitors focus on the more obvious megafauna. Fundamental ecological principles transcend planetary boundaries. Ranger VREL. Professor Evara responded, suddenly formal. Now, students, please review your assignments and prepare your equipment for tomorrow. Dawn comes early here. Later that night, when the station's lighting had dimmed to simulate Earth's nocturnal cycle, Nico Voss found himself unable to sleep. Despite adjusting his chamber's atmospheric controls, the unfamiliar sounds penetrating from outside kept triggering his threat response system. Distant hoots, occasional rustling, and periodic cracking noises from the forest created a terrifying soundscape for someone evolved in a world where most predators hunted in absolute silence. Each new sound sent adrenaline surging through his system until he finally gave up on rest altogether. Pulling on his environmental suit, Nico Voss decided to sneak out the calming tea substitute that Sarah Queen had packed. Perhaps in the common area, with the station's walls between him and the wilderness, he might find enough peace to rest. The common area was darkened when he entered, illuminated only by the ambient glow of monitoring equipment, and, unexpectedly, by moonlight streaming through an open exterior door. Alarmed, Nico Voss approached the door, concerned about security breaches. What he saw stopped him cold. Professor Evara stood in the clearing before the station, her environmental suit nowhere to be seen. More shocking still, she was barefoot, her greenish-blue skin exposed directly to Earth's environment. Her face was tilted upward towards the falling rain, arms slightly extended, palms open to the sky in what appeared to be an attitude of worship or supplication. Nico Voss must have made some sound, because Professor Evara suddenly turned, her expression shifting from serene joy to startled guilt when she saw him. Nico Voss, she began, quickly composing herself and stepping back toward the doorway. I was just collecting precipitation samples, without collection equipment or protective gear. Nico Voss's voice reflected his confusion. Professor, are you ill? Should I alert medical services? No, nothing like that. Professor Evara waved dismissively as she re-entered the station, water dripping from her skin onto the floor. Just an experimental approach. Direct contact provides certain sensory data that instruments miss, but the pathogens are largely incompatible with our physiology, she finished briskly. The real dangers on Earth require more substantial exposure. Brief contact is an acceptable risk for a senior researcher. Nico Voss wasn't convinced. Professor, your behavior seems irregular. Professor Evara's expression softened. Nico Voss, xenobiology isn't just about observation through barriers. Sometimes understanding requires immersion, control, risk-taking. She placed a damp hand on his shoulder. Get some rest. Tomorrow will challenge your preconceptions in ways you can't imagine. Before he could question her further, she disappeared down the corridor towards her quarters, leaving Nico Voss staring after her with growing suspicion that there was much more to Professor Evara Narn than any of her students had ever realized. Morning arrived with an intensity that left the students blinking in confusion as sunlight filtered through the forest canopy in dappled patterns. After a quick briefing on sample collection protocols, they set out on their first official expedition, a survey of small vertebrate populations in the surrounding forest. Remember to maintain sealed collection procedures, Professor Evara instructed as they followed a narrow trail. Even mild Earth organisms can carry microbes dangerous to non-terrestrial systems. Professor Sarah Quinn raised her hand habitually. The weather forecast indicates potential precipitation. Should we delay until conditions improve? It always indicates potential precipitation, Ranger Elara commented with a slight smile. They don't call it a biodense zone for nothing. The research schedule accommodates typical weather patterns, Professor Evara assured them. A little rain won't harm our collection efforts. As if summoned by her words, the distant rumble of thunder rolled across the forest, causing several students to glance nervously upward. Just the storm front moving through, Ranger Elara said casually. Fairly common this time of year. We have storms on Australis, Jace Rin pointed out, trying to sound brave despite his evident unease. Not like Earth storms, his twin responded quietly. The forest darkened perceptibly as clouds gathered overhead, filtered sunlight dimming, until the students' suits automatically activated supplementary illumination. The first drops fell sporadically, pattering against leaves and creating an eerie percussion that grew steadily more intense. Within minutes, the sporadic drops transformed into a proper downpour. Water cascaded through the canopy, quickly saturating the ground and forming rivulets across the path. The students huddled together, environmental shields activated, watching in horror as the world seemingly dissolved around them. "This is the worst," Nico Voss shouted over the drumming of rain. "Acid is literally falling from the sky." "It's just water," Ranger Elara called back, standing unprotected as the rain soaked her uniform. "Your suits can handle it." To the students' collective shock, Professor Evara deactivated her environmental shield, stepping out into the downpour with an expression of undisguised joy. "Isn't it magnificent?" she exclaimed, turning her face upward exactly as Nico Voss had seen her do the night before. "Professor," Sarah Quinn gasped, "your protective protocols." "Sometimes," Evara responded, rain streaming down her face. "You need to experience a phenomenon to truly understand it." She extended her hands, catching the water in her palms. "This is how Earth renews itself. The hydrological cycle in action. Water evaporates, forms clouds, returns to Earth, sustains all terrestrial life, and begins again." Ranger Elara watched Evara with an expression that shifted from professional composure to something more complex. Recognition, perhaps even affection. "Should have brought raincoats," she commented, opening a pack and pulling out several folded garments. "These won't help your equipment, but they'll keep you a little drier." The storm intensified, making further sample collection impossible. They retreated to a natural shelter formed by massive tree roots, watching sheets of water transform the forest into a flowing, liquid landscape. "I don't understand," Corinne Venn said, furiously making notes despite the conditions. "How do Earth organisms survive this regular submersion?" "They don't survive despite it," Evara corrected, her expression almost evangelical in its intensity. "They survive because of it. These rains feed the entire ecosystem, from the smallest fungi to the tallest trees. But the erosion, the flooding, the electrical discharges," Sarah Quinn began. "All part of the system," Ranger Elara interjected. "The forest has adapted to use these conditions. Those fallen trees become nurse logs for new growth. Seasonal floods distribute nutrients, Lightning causes natural fire breaks and releases nitrogen into the soil. Chaos as creation, Avara murmured, so quietly that only Nico Voss, standing nearest to her, could hear. When the rain finally subsided, they continued their expedition, although the original research plan had been thoroughly disrupted. As they followed a new path, Ranger Ilara suggested the twins, ever curious despite the challenges, veered slightly off trail to examine a particular flowering plant. "Professor," Kale Rin called excitedly. "This species shows bioluminescent properties even in daylight." Before Avara could respond, a loud buzzing erupted from around the plant. The twins jumped back, but not quickly enough. A swarm of small flying organisms emerged, surrounding them in an angry cloud. "Bees!" Ranger Ilara shouted. "Everyone back! Now!" The twins activated their emergency shields, just as the insects began impacting the energy barrier, creating a bizarre light show as each tiny creature bounced off with an electrical sizzle. The rest of the group retreated hastily, watching as Ranger Ilara calmly removed a small device from her belt and activated it. A barely perceptible hum filled the air, and the insects gradually dispersed, returning to their disturbed nest. "Sonic pacification," she explained, returning the device to her belt. "Mimics their queen's stand-down signal." "You carry specific technology just for these creatures?" Lyrics asked incredulously. "They're pollinators," Ranger Ilara said simply. "Essential to the ecosystem. We avoid harming them whenever possible." "A fascinating defense response," Professor Avara noted. "Apis mellifera employs a collective defensive strategy, prioritizing hive protection over individual survival. The stinger barb actually detaches, defeat the individual, but allowing the venom sac to continue pumping toxin." Ranger Ilara raised an eyebrow at Avara's detailed knowledge, while Nico Voss noted this as yet another peculiarity in his growing mental catalog of the professor's suspicious behaviors. Back at the Xenolab outpost that evening, the students gathered in the common area to process the day's limited samples and calibrate their equipment for the next expedition. Despite the challenges, they had collected several interesting specimens that now occupied the analysis chambers. Preliminary results indicate extraordinary microbial diversity, Sarah Quinn reported, examining a soil sample. This single cubic centimeter contains over 9 million distinct organisms. Earth's biodiversity remains 9 of its defining characteristics. Professor Ayavara agreed. Even after several extinction events, the adaptive radiation of surviving lineages creates new ecological niches. "It's insane," Nico Voss muttered, still recovering from the day's multiple stresses. No rational civilization would establish settlements in such conditions. Yet humans have lived here for thousands of years, Ranger Ilara pointed out from where she was updating the station's security logs. Long before modern technology, which explains a great deal about human psychology, Lyrics observed dryly. Constant exposure to environmental threats would necessarily produce a species with disproportionate risk tolerance. Ranger Ilara laughed. "You might be right about that. We do have a tendency to see challenges as opportunities." "Speaking of challenges," Avara interjected, "tomorrow's expedition focuses on larger vertebrate observation. We'll be using the station blind near the river junction. Will we see apex predators?" Jex and Kell asked simultaneously, their enthusiasm entirely undiminished by the day's mishaps. "Possibly," Ranger Ilara acknowledged. "The area is known territory for several cougar and bear individuals, but we'll be observing from a safe distance with appropriate barriers." Later that night, Nico Voss once again found himself unable to sleep. The day's events had left him physically exhausted, but mentally alert. his thoughts continuously returning to Professor Ayvara's strange behaviors. A respected academic with multiple published works on comparative xenobiology, Ayvara had always been somewhat eccentric in the classroom, but nothing in her university persona had hinted at the almost reverential attitude she displayed toward Earth. Determined to understand, Nico Voss decided to access the station's data terminal to research the professor's academic background more thoroughly. Perhaps her previous work would explain her unusual familiarity with Earth's systems. As he entered the common area, he heard voices, Ayvara and Ranger Elara speaking quietly near the exterior door, not in the formal tones of colleagues, but with the easy familiarity of old friends. "They're adapting better than you expected," Ranger Elara was saying. "Even your nervous nine, Nico Voss, showed real interest in that snake." "They're brilliant students," Ayvara replied warmly. "Just bound by preconceptions, academic xenobiology has become too sanitized, all simulations and controlled laboratory environments. Like you were before Mom and Dad found you." Ranger Elara's voice held a gentle teasing. Nico Voss froze. What was this human implying? "I wasn't found. I was rescued," Ayvara corrected with a laugh that sounded nothing like her professional demeanor. "And yes, exactly like I was, 11 years old, believing everything on Earth was trying to defeat me. In fairness, Ayvara, that cougar actually was trying to defeat you." Ayvara. Nico Voss's mind raced. No nine called Professor Ayvara none by a nickname. Certainly not a human-sounding nine. A misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Ayvara, or Ayvara, dismissed with audible affection. "I was in her territory, looking like prey." "You were in her territory, being prey," Ranger Elara corrected. "If Dad hadn't been tracking that radio signal from your parents' ship, I wouldn't be here," Ayvara finished solemnly. "I know not a day passes that I don't think about that." Nico Voss must have made some involuntary sound, because both women suddenly fell silent. He stepped forward, knowing he'd been discovered. "Professor, what's going on? Who's Ayvara?" Ayvara and Ranger Elara exchanged a long look before the professor sighed deeply. "I suppose it was inevitable," she said, gesturing for Nico Voss to join them. "Especially with you, Nico Voss. You always did question assumptions." "What assumptions? What are you talking about?" Nico Voss looked between them, confusion giving way to the beginnings of understanding. You know this human personally." "Ranger Elara is my foster sister," Ayvara said quietly, "or as close to it as interspecies adoption allows." "Adoption?" Nico Voss repeated, struggling to process this revelation. Ayvara nodded, her usual professional demeanor falling away completely. "I wasn't always Professor Narn of Astralis University. Before that, I was just Ayvara, a frightened alien child, sole survivor of a research expedition gone wrong." "You're from Earth?" Nico Voss couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "Not originally, no. I was born on Astralis, like you." Ayvara's gaze moved to the darkness beyond the windows, where Earth's wilderness pulsed with nocturnal life. "My parents were xenobiologists, the genuine kind, not the sanitized academic version I've become. They took risks, believing true understanding required immersion. They brought a child to a death world." Nico Voss was horrified. "They brought their family on a carefully planned research expedition," Ayvara corrected gently. "The atmospheric anomaly that damaged their ship wasn't predictable. They managed an emergency landing, but..." She paused, old grief visible in her eyes. "They didn't survive the crash. I did, protected in the emergency pod they placed me in." Ranger Elara picked up the story. My parents were park rangers back then. They detected the ship's emergency beacon and found Tali wandering in the forest, half-starved and terrified. Convinced everything on Earth was trying to defeat me, Ayavara added with a sad smile, which, from an Australian perspective, wasn't entirely wrong. But contact with unfiltered Earth environment, the pathogens alone, Nico Voss began. We're mostly incompatible with my physiology, Ayavara finished. Just as I told you last night, the Virel family contacted Australian authorities, but bureaucratic processes, being what they are, it took nearly 5 years for the formal interspecies response, during which time my parents did what any decent person would do. They raised a scared alien child as their own. Ranger Ilara said matter-of-factly, Mom was a xenobiologist herself, so she knew how to adapt Tali's diet and environment. They saved my life, Ayavara said simply, and showed me that Earth wasn't just a death world to be feared. It was a living system to be understood. Nico Voss stared at his professor, this alien who had grown up on Earth, with a new understanding. So, this field trip is partially selfish, Ayavara admitted. I wanted to come home, to share this world that shaped me with students who might appreciate its complexity. Her expression grew more serious, but it's also genuine xenobiology, Nico Voss. You can't truly understand adaptation without experiencing the conditions that drive it. Before Nico Voss could respond, the station's emergency alert system activated, bathing the room in pulsing red light. Weather advisory, the automated system announced. Severe storm front approaching. Projected wind velocities exceeding safety parameters. Ranger Ilara moved immediately to the monitoring station, checking readings with practiced efficiency. It's a big 9, she confirmed grimly. Coming in fast from the Oceanus. We need to wake the others and activate the station's defensive protocols. The next hour passed in organized chaos, as the students were roused and briefed on the emergency procedures. Despite their panic at yet another Earth catastrophe, they responded with the disciplined focus of well-trained academics, securing equipment and reinforcing the station's structural integrity. The atmospheric shields will protect us from debris, Ranger Ilara explained as she activated the station's defensive systems. But these storms can last for hours. We should prepare for power fluctuations and possible communication disruptions with your ship. This is the worst, Nico Voss muttered, but with less conviction than before. After the revelations about Evora, his perspective had begun to shift subtly. As if Earth itself had heard his waning fear as a challenge, a tremendous crack split the night, followed by a heavy impact that shook the entire station. Emergency lights flickered as backup systems engaged. Direct strike, Ranger Ilara reported, checking the damage assessments. Lightning hit the primary shield generator. We're on auxiliary power. Structural integrity, Ayavara asked, all traces of sentimentality gone as she shifted into emergency management mode. Holding. But the East Wing shield is compromised, Ranger Ilara responded. We need to move everyone to the central chamber until the storm passes. As they began relocating essential equipment and supplies, another massive impact rocked the station. A section of ceiling in the laboratory area collapsed inward, bringing a tangle of branches and water cascading into the room. Lyrics! Sarah Quinn screamed as part of the debris struck the crystalline student, shattering a portion of her protective exoskeleton. Evara and Corin Venn pushed to Lyrix's side. Her normally luminous structure had darkened where the damage occurred, a sign of severe systematic shock in her species. She needs immediate medical attention, Corin Venn reported, scanner in hand. Crystal fragments have entered her fluid circulation system. The medical supplies are in the East Wing, Jace Rin finished. looking toward the now inaccessible section of the station. "We can't reach them through conventional means," Ranger Elara confirmed after checking the security system. "The structural damage is too severe." "What about extraction?" Sarah Quinn asked desperately. "The emergency protocol." "Communications are down," Avara cut in, checking her own device. "We can't contact the Vanguard until the storm passes, or we restore the primary systems." Nico Voss watched his professor closely, recognizing the rapid calculations occurring behind her eyes. "Professor, what are you thinking?" "There is another option," Ivara said quietly. "Traditional medicine." "You mean earth plants?" Nico Voss couldn't keep the horror from his voice. "The indigenous peoples of this region use specific botanical compounds for thousands of years, before modern technology," Ivara explained rapidly. "You want to treat her with random earth flora?" Sarah Queen was aghast. "The toxicity risks alone." "Not random," Ivara corrected firmly. "Specific compounds, I know, from both personal experience and scientific research." A moment of tense silence followed as the implications settled over the group. No standard xenobiological procedure would recommend such an approach, yet their options were rapidly dwindling as Mira's condition deteriorated. "Our need to go outside," Ivara continued, already moving toward her environmental suit. "The plants we need grow near the riverbank, about half a mile from here." In this storm, Nico Voss couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Professor, that's self-sacrifice. For someone who doesn't know Earth, perhaps," Avara agreed, securing her suit. "But I grew up on these forests, Nico Voss. I know them better than any simulation. I'm coming with you," Elara stated. Not a question, but a declaration as she gathered emergency equipment. "And me," Nico Voss heard himself say, surprising everyone, including himself. "6 is safer than 4, and I want to see." Ivara studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Quickly then, "Corin Ven, monitor Lyrix's vital signs. Sarah Quinn, continue attempts to establish communication with the Imperial. Kyle Rin, Jace Rin, secure the remaining structure as best you can." Minutes later, Nico Voss found himself standing at the station's emergency exit, fully suited, but feeling utterly unprepared as Ivara detailed their mission to Elara. "We need 6 components: red cedar bark, salmonberry root, and the blue lichen that grows on the north-facing rock near the water. The combination creates a poultice that can stabilize Lyrix's crystal matrix long enough for proper medicinal treatment. Cedar Grove is closest." Elara nodded, checking her handheld navigation device. "We can move along the ridgeline to avoid the worst flooding." The station door opened, and Earth's full fury crashed over them. Wind howled through the forest, bending massive trees like they were saplings. Rain fell not in drops, but in sheets, reducing visibility to mere meters. Periodic flashes of lightning transformed the landscape into stark relief before plunging it back into darkness. "This is the worst," Nico Voss shouted over the tempest, gripping a nearby railing to maintain his balance. "This is Earth," Ivara called back, her voice filled with unexpected exhilaration. "Focus on your footing. Follow exactly where we step." They moved into the forest like swimmers entering a dangerous current, deliberate, strategic, and hyper-aware. Elara led, finding paths where Nico Voss saw only chaos. Ivara followed, occasionally pointing out features invisible to Nico Voss's untrained eye. He brought up the rear, concentrating on placing his feet precisely where Ivara had stepped. As they progressed, Nico Voss made a startling realization. He wasn't merely terrified anymore. Beneath the fear lay something new, a humming alertness, an engagement with his surroundings that the academic study had never provoked. Each successful step, each obstacle navigated, built a peculiar confidence. They reached the cedar grove first, where Avara efficiently harvested strips of bark from a fallen giant while explaining its properties. The tannins bind with crystalline structures, reinforcing microfractures. Indigenous people used it for everything from rope to medicine. The journey to collect the salmonberry roots proved more challenging. The normal trail had been transformed into a rushing stream by the rainfall, forcing them to forge a new path through dense undergrowth. "Stay close," Elara warned as they approached a steep embankment. "The soil is saturated, a landslide risk." As if summoned by her caution, the ground beneath them shifted. Nico Voss felt the terrible sensation of solidity giving way to fluid motion as a section of hillside began sliding downward, carrying all 6 of them with it. "Grab something stable," Avara shouted, reaching for an exposed tree root. Nico Voss flailed, panic overwhelming his rational mind, until his hand closed around a sturdy sapling. He held fast as mud and debris flowed past him. When the movement finally stopped, he found himself dangling partially over a newly formed ravine, the sapling his only anchor to stable ground. "Nico Voss, are you injured?" Avara called from somewhere above. I don't think so," he managed, his voice shaking almost as much as his limbs. "Just precariously positioned. Hold on," Ranger Ilara's voice came from his right. "I'm working my way toward you." As he clung to the sapling, Nico Voss noticed something unusual about the newly exposed soil wall before him. A network of pale structures weaving through the earth like a complex tapestry. "Professor?" he called, scientific curiosity momentarily overriding fear. "There's some kind of subsurface organism here. A mycelium at work, perhaps?" "Tree roots and fungal hyphae," Avara confirmed, her voice closer now. "They form a symbiotic network throughout the forest floor, a communication system and nutrient exchange pathway." Ranger Ilara appeared at the edge of the ravine above him. "Can you climb up if I secure a line?" With their guidance, Nico Voss managed to haul himself back to stable ground. Once safe, he turned to examine the phenomenon more closely. "It's incredible," he murmured, forgetting momentarily about their urgent mission. The entire forest is interconnected at a subterranean level. Earth's systems are rarely as separate as they appear, Ivara said, a teacher even in crisis. Competition exists, but cooperation is equally fundamental. Now, we need to continue. Lyrix's time is limited. They located the salmonberry plants downstream, their distinctive leaves visible even in the storm's gloom. As Ivara carefully excavated the roots, explaining their medicinal properties, Nico Voss found himself seeing Earth through new eyes, not as a chaotic death world, but as an intricate system where apparent dangers were often part of deeper balances. The final component, the blue lichen, proved the most challenging to locate. The riverside rocks had been partially submerged by the rising water, obscuring their usual landmarks. There, Ranger Ilara pointed to a cluster of boulders where a faint blue glow was just visible beneath the water's surface. But the current's too strong for her direct approach. "We'll need to cross upstream and work our way down," Avara decided, studying the churning water with experienced eyes. "Professor," Nico Voss said hesitantly, "I have an idea." He pointed to a fallen tree spanning a narrow section of the river. "If we use that as a bridge, I can approach from above rather than fighting the current." Avara and Ranger. Ilara exchanged surprised glances. "That's actually a good plan," Ranger Ilara acknowledged. "Dangerous," Ivara added, but efficient. I've been paying attention, Nico Voss said simply. Earth teaches adaptation, right? The crossing was treacherous, the logs slick with rain and moss, the water below angry and insistent. Nico Voss moved with a caution born of proper fear, but not the paralyzing panic that would have gripped him days earlier. Reaching the midpoint, he carefully lowered himself toward the submerged rocks where the lichen grew. "Steady," Avara called. "You only need a small amount." His fingers closed around the slimy yet fibrous texture of the lichen, just as a surge of water threatened his position. With 9 hands anchored to the log and the other clutching their prize, Nico Voss felt a surge of triumph that transcended academic achievement. "I've got it," he called, carefully working his way back. As they hurried back towards the Xenolab outpost, collection complete, Nico Voss realized something had fundamentally shifted within him. The forest remained objectively dangerous, perhaps more so than ever as the storm continued to rage. Yet his relationship to that danger had transformed. "This is," he began, then paused, searching for the right words. "This is remarkable." Avara glanced back at him, understanding blooming in her expression. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." Back at the station, they found Myra's condition had remained critical. Working with practiced efficiency, Avara prepared the botanical compound, explaining each step of the process. The cedar tannins bind the matrix, while the salmonberry enzymes prevent further crystal degradation. The lichen contains a natural biofluorescent compound that accelerates a lattice reconstruction. "That's not in any xenobiology textbook," Sarah Quinn observed, watching with skeptical fascination. "Because it's not xeno anything. It's integration," Avara responded, applying the resulting paste to Myra's damaged exoskeleton. Earth substances affecting non-Earth biology through compatible biochemical pathways. To everyone's amazement, the treatment began working almost immediately. Myra's crystalline structure regained some of its characteristic luminosity as the compound was absorbed. "Incredible," Corin Venn murmured, recording the process in meticulous detail. The organic compounds are actually facilitating crystal regrowth along the original lattice structure. Earth life forms evolved to repair and adapt, Avara explained, her voice taking on the familiar cadence of a lecture. Their biochemistry contains solutions to problems universal to all life, maintaining structural integrity, repairing damage, adapting to stress. The storm raged throughout the night, but the Xenolab outpost held. By morning, the worst had passed, leaving a forest transformed, branches down, new channels carved by water, the landscape rearranged but fundamentally intact. As sunlight filtered through the broken clouds, communications with the Vanguard were re-established. The orbital vessel, having detached the storm and lost contact with the ground team, had already dispatched an emergency extraction shuttle. Vessel arrival estimated in 60 minutes, the communication system announced. Emergency medical team on board. Lyrics, now conscious though still weak, sat supported by Sarah Quinn and Corin Venn. "You used earth plants on me?" she asked, her voice carrying its usual monotone, but with an undercurrent of wonder. "Professor Tyloka did," Nico Voss corrected. "She knew Earth's secrets could help even when our technology couldn't." The students gathered around as Tyloka checked Lyrix's readings 9 final time. The aftermath of the storm had created a strange intimacy among them, a shared experience that had transformed their academic relationship into something deeper. "The extraction team will want a full report," Tyloka said, looking around at her bedraggled students. "How shall we explain what happened here?" "We tell them we conducted proper xenobiological research," Corin Venn suggested. his datapad filled with new observations. We experience the environment we were studying. We tell them Earth isn't just a death world, Nico Voss added, surprising himself with his conviction. It's a complete system where apparent dangers are often essential components of greater balance. Tyloka smiled, not her professional academic smile, but the genuine expression Nico Voss had glimpsed when she stood in the rain. Well said, Nico Voss, as they prepared for extraction, gathering their equipment and samples. Drenny approached Nico Voss with something in her hands. A parting gift, she said, offering him a small container. Inside was a seedling, 9 of Earth's plants, its delicate leaves unfurling with new growth. It's a western hemlock. They start small, but given time, they can grow over 60 meters tall. Nico Voss stared at the tiny plant with newfound appreciation. Will it survive off-world? With the right care, Drenny nodded. They're more adaptable than they look. The extraction shuttle arrived precisely on schedule, descending through the clearing mist with precision. The medical team rushed to evaluate Myra, expressing professional astonishment at the effectiveness of the native treatment while transferring her to proper equipment. As they prepared to board, Professor Tyloka paused for a private moment with Drenny, sisters saying goodbye, while the students made their final observations of the forest that had challenged everything they thought they knew. Professor? Nico Voss approached Tyloka as she rejoined the group. I've been wondering, did you plan all this? Not the storm, obviously, but this experience. Us learning that a death world isn't just dangerous, but educational. Tyloka's expression turned thoughtful. I planned a field study, Nico Voss. What you learned from it was entirely your own achievement. She glanced back at the forest. Though I might have hoped for something like this outcome. 6 months later, Nico Voss stood before the Australis University Xenobiological Society, presenting his research findings from the Earth expedition. The audience, professors, researchers, and fellow students, listened with varying degrees of skepticism as he outlined their experiences. Traditional xenobiology views Class 9 environments as hostile systems to be studied from safe distances, he explained, gesturing to the holographic display of Earth's biodense zone. Our research suggests this perspective is fundamentally limited. The data scrolled behind him, detailed analyses of Earth organisms, atmospheric conditions, and symbiotic relationships, all meticulously documented despite the expedition's challenges. Deathworld classification focuses on dangers to non-adapted visitors, Nico Voss continued, warming to his subject. But this framework fails to recognize that what appears as danger is often essential function. Earth's gravity, atmosphere, weather patterns, and biological diversity are more than just threats. They're interconnected systems that drive adaptation, resilience, and complexity. In the front row, Professor Tyloka watched her once timid student with evident pride. Beside her sat Myra, fully recovered, her crystalline structure now bearing fascinating new growth patterns where the Earth compounds had facilitated healing. Our most significant finding wasn't a particular organism or interaction, Nico Voss concluded, but a methodological insight. True xenobiological understanding requires more than observation. It demands experience. The controlled risk of immersion yields knowledge unobtainable through remote study alone. As the presentation ended and questions began, Nico Voss fielded them with newfound confidence. On his desk, in his quarters, The western hemlock seedling had already grown several centimeters. Its adaptive processes quietly defined conventional wisdom about transplantation. Beside it stood a framed image, the research team on their final day on Earth, soaking wet, muddy, and genuinely smiling despite their ordeal. Tyloka had insisted on capturing the moment, positioning them all beneath a massive cedar tree, with rain still dripping from its branches. Across the bottom, Nico Voss had written a simple caption, "Field Trip Fiasco, Earth 3126. But the label no longer seemed appropriate. What had begun as a disaster had transformed into something else entirely, a lesson more valuable than any classroom could provide. In the quiet moments between his new research projects, Nico Voss sometimes found himself missing the sound of rain falling through ancient beechen trees. The sensation surprised him, this longing for a world that had once terrified him. He'd begun preliminary applications for a return expedition, this time with a research focus he would never have considered before. Adaptive stress as evolutionary advantage, Earth's lessons for Australian systems. Professor Tyloka had approved the proposal immediately, with a handwritten note that simply read, "The worst experiences often make the best teachers. Welcome to real xenobiology." And so, from the storms and soil of Earth, a new generation of xenobiologists emerged, not merely as observers, but as participants. What they brought back was more than data. It was perspective, humility, and a living reminder that even the harshest environments can nurture resilience, connection, and unexpected growth.